So welcome everyone for this late afternoon panel, the last panel of this exciting symposium. I'm Svenja Bethke. I'm the Deputy Director of the Stanley Burton Center for Holocaust and Genocide Studies, and it's my great pleasure to chair this panel on recreating narratives between history and memory. And we will have two speakers in this panel. One of them is Betsy Inlow, and it's my great pleasure. Betsy is a PhD student at our center. To first introduce Betsy, and then the second talk will be given by Joël Cahen on Maps, Models, Memory, Second Generation Art in the Netherlands. And I will introduce Joël before he will start with his presentation. So I will now start by introducing Betsy. So as I said, Betsy Inlow is a history PhD student within the Stanley Burton Center for Holocaust and Genocide Studies at the University of Leicester. Her doctoral research is looking into ways in which graphic novels and other forms of non-traditional media surrounding the Holocaust can be used by museums, memorials, and schools to enhance their Holocaust and human rights education programs. She's currently also working as a research assistant for the project that I'm sure many of you have heard of today, Narrative Art and Visual Storytelling in Holocaust and Human Rights Education. And today, Betsy will give a talk entitled Visual Narratives of Identity, the Creative Process of Third Generation Comic Artist Miriam Libicki. So please, Betsy, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you so much, Svenja, for that wonderful introduction. And thank you to Fransiska and Imogen for this wonderful conference. It has been an absolute joy so far. So yes, as Svenja said, I will be presenting on third generation comic artist Miriam Libicki, who I know from this project, Narrative Art and Visual Storytelling in Holocaust and Human Rights Education, for which I am a research assistant. So that is how I know her. And this presentation will be primarily off of a semi-structured interview that I had with her this past February. So that will be the primary data set for today. And just to say, I really wish I could have included a bit more secondary sources in this presentation, but it being only 20 minutes long, I really thought that the interview should be the star of the show. But I have included a very extensive list of secondary sources that relate to what I'm talking about today. And so if there's any particular kind of concept that you would like to read more about, since this is being recorded, you can go back and look at the references section at the end, and please feel free to read more into those topics. So yes, this photo here, or this drawing, I'm sorry, a photo of a drawing, is one that Miriam created for the Narrative Art and Visual Storytelling project, which I will call that NAVS for short, so that I'm not saying the whole thing every single time. So this is for the NAVS project, and in that project, 3 comic artists collaborate with 4 Holocaust survivors to create graphic narratives, graphic novels of the survivors' experiences of the Holocaust. So Miriam is working with survivor David Schaefer, who is pictured here in her drawing, and that is chronicling his experiences of the Holocaust in Transnistria. Okay, so without further ado, we will start. Just an overview of today's discussion. I will introduce you to Miriam and her work, and then we will look at the role of identity, in particular Jewish identity and third generation identity, how that plays a very large role in Miriam's comics. And within this, we will look at differences between second and third generation experiences of comics and the visual arts, as seen by Miriam within our discussion that we had in February, and comics as a particularly good catalyst of identity exploration. Then finally, we will look at Miriam's experiences creating specifically visual narratives of the Holocaust. So within this framework, we will look at comics' role or potential role in broaching historical distancing, which of course becomes more and more important as time goes on and we get further and further from the occurrences of the Holocaust. And we'll also look at the potential for graphic narratives to stimulate further testimony, which in Miriam's case did occur. We'll look at trends in third generation Holocaust graphic narratives and the impact of specifically these Holocaust graphic novels that Miriam has worked on public perceptions of Miriam's Jewish identity. So how public perception has changed kind of before and after she worked on these Holocaust graphic narratives. So just an introduction to Miriam. There she is. Again, a third generation graphic novelist of Polish Jewish heritage. And she also has dual American Israeli citizenship. And she's lived many, many places. She grew up in Ohio, but she has also lived in Israel and was for a while in the IDF, the Israeli Defense Forces. She's also lived in Canada and is currently living in France as the, I'm going to try to speak French here, sorry, as the cartoonist in residence at Maison des Arthurs. That's as good as I can do with my French there. But yes, and she is working on her graphic novel over here, Glass-Nosed Kids, while she is a cartoonist in residence in France. So yes, and just a brief overview of the compendium of Miriam's comics. First, to the left here, we have Jobnik. That was her first full-length published graphic novel, and that is chronicling her time in the IDF as a non-combatant soldier. So that is where the title comes from. Jobnik is a bit of a slur for a non-combatant soldier. So that is a very, very personal narrative, very autobiographical, and she explores her identity and kind of coming of age in that story. Then Toward a Hot Jew was her next published graphic narrative, technically a collection of graphic essays. And she very much, again, explores concepts of identity in these essays. She looks at herself within kind of the Jewish artistic tradition, how she fits within that. And I'm sorry, I just had a little bit of a, I have anxiety problems sometimes, but it's okay. Okay, so yes, Toward a Hot Jew, she looks at identity. And again, if we hadn't followed the rules, I wouldn't be here. That is her graphic novel that she's working on for the NAVS project about David Schaefer. And finally, Glass-Nosed Kids. She is looking at her experiences growing up in Ohio when many Soviet refugees, Jewish Soviet refugees, came to live in Ohio, where she is from. And she features her grandmother's story of being under Soviet occupation during the Holocaust in that story. Okay, so getting into the interview now. And just so you know, I do know that some of these panels are a bit wordy. I did that on purpose, though, because I thought what Miriam had to say was very, very interesting and very important. And again, since this is being recorded, I thought if people are interested, they can go back and look at it. So yes, I apologize if it gets a little bit too wordy sometimes, but I will be reading the bold for time's sake. So yes, but please go back and look if you're interested at the fuller picture. So I started our interview by saying, do you feel that being third generation has affected your work as an artist? And she said, I think a little bit. I think that third generation means that I understand the impact, but I don't always feel the impact. And she continues on to say, in fact, when I started in comics, I kind of had a thing which was thinking, though I'm a descendant of Polish Jews, I'm not ever going to do a Holocaust comic. I mean, Mouse is the most famous English language graphic novel, arguably, and so that was it right there. It was kind of something I wanted to get away from, like I wanted to say, I don't have to write that sort of story just because I'm a Polish American Jew. Something that made me come around to wanting to be involved in this kind of story more is my grandparents getting older, and just feeling like this is a kind of way to connect with my ancestry, with my past, and that it's an opportunity that could be lost if I don't take it. So just in case people don't know, knowing this audience, most people have probably read Mouse or at least know about it, but Mouse is Art Spiegelman's Pulitzer Prize winning graphic narrative about chronicling his father's experiences of the Holocaust. And in it, everyone, all the characters are animals. So Jews are mice, Nazis are cats, etc. And so Miriam saying this very much interested me into how many artists are feeling this way, how many second generation, third generation, or even survivors, first generation survivors are feeling this way, that kind of this story's already been told. Of course, Miriam ultimately decided to create these stories anyway. But it's just something to think about, how these artists may be feeling, considering kind of the graphic narratives that are already out there. Then we talked about third generation versus second generation comic artists specifically. So I asked, how do you think your experiences as a third generation artist differs from those of second generation artists? And she says, I think a lot of second generation artists, if the main focus is the parents' experience, there is always some part of the secondary trauma or the ways that they may not have been parented properly because of some sort of lack that the trauma created in their parents. So, I'm glad that it was a little bit removed and I didn't have the baggage of, was David a good grandpa or not? And that's one reason that I didn't have to insert myself or didn't have to be like, am I showing him in a light that's too positive or negative? Like, I could really take him at face value. And this concept that Miriam hits on here, of course, we've discussed a lot today at our symposium, whatever kind of your preferred framework of that, inherited trauma or post-memory. These concepts are very heavily explored in second generation Holocaust graphic novels. So on the left here, we see Michel Kitschka's second generation. Here he is discussing in the scene, he doesn't want to go to Auschwitz with his father. He says, I grew up with its ghosts. I grew up with its symbols. I grew up in its stench. Again, very, very visually showing how directly his father's experiences of the Holocaust have then affected his life. And Art Spiegelman in Mouse does the same thing over here on the right. This is actually the very first scene in Mouse. And he says to his father, Art is a small boy here, again, portrayed as a mouse. And he says, I fell and my friends skated away without me. And his father says, friends, your friends, if you lock them together in a room with no food for a week, then you could see what it is, friends. So at least in Miriam's experience, as she says, she feels that in comparison to Michel or Art or some other second generation comic artists, that she can distance herself a little bit more, being third generation. Then in our interview, we continued on to discuss comics as a particularly good catalyst of identity exploration. So she says, I think comics are a really good way to show subjectivity. And since that's the case, as a person who's already interested in identity, I like using this in a conscious way. I like drawing myself in comics and drawing a very specific version of myself in comics. And it might be a different specific version depending on which comic you have. And I think also the fact that you're drawing as well as telling means that you can keep something in front of somebody's eyes. So I think comics really foreground the narrator or protagonist in a special way. And here we see, I've included a couple of little Miriams. This is what she uses in her comics on occasion. She draws herself as the protagonist. And again, she's there telling the story as a embodied person. So it's a very effective way of exploring identity for her. And then we've discussed comics and identity in comics as well as battling historical distancing or potentially battling historical distancing. So I asked her, do you think the exploration of identity in graphic novels can help combat the historical distancing of Holocaust testimony? And she said, yeah, I think it can. I think that when you have an artist with their own sensibility, that's one thing that helps to break the mold. And especially us doing these short graphic novels, which center on one person, and they are a real person rather than some sort of composite, helps us hone in on small details. And small details are one of the things that can really cause identification, that can cause that distance to be eliminated. So again, here we have David Schaefer as a boy in If We Had Followed the Rules, I Wouldn't Be Here, from the NAVS project. And I thought this was a particularly good kind of moving scene here where, of course, David is having a very difficult time during the Holocaust, but he is able to have a moment of peace and happiness at one point in the comic book with his family. And we explored how graphic narrative projects can, at times, and in Miriam's case, stimulate further testimony. So Miriam says, I feel like in the last year, I've had more conversations with my grandma about her survival experience, her wartime experience, than maybe in my whole life prior to that. That's another thing I've gotten out of the project, the NAVS project, is that it gave me and my grandmother an excuse to talk about this stuff. And so here on the right, we see Miriam discussing her grandmother's life during the Holocaust. And this is a scene that will be in Glasnost Kids that she is working on right now. And we can look at, if we look at Miriam's Glasnost Kids and some other third generation Holocaust graphic narratives, we can see some very interesting trends. So when describing Glasnost Kids, Miriam says, there's a section where I present our early high school years from a bunch of different perspectives. And then there's my personal flashbacks as well. And it kind of continues on to the present day to talk about Jewish identity and what choices people are making around religious identification or community or politics. Any Soviet roots I have, that's my grandma's story because she lived under Soviet occupation for the war. So here I do bring in a little bit of the secondary literature, Asaf Gamzu's framework here, the trends that he has identified looking at third generation Holocaust graphic narratives. So he identifies the following, that there's a focus on personal or national narratives instead of purely Holocaust narratives. Color is used instead of monochrome. The third person is used as opposed to first person, and fiction or artifice is used as opposed to nonfiction and testimony. So of course, just like any kind of collection of trends or a framework such as this, it's very rare that you're gonna hit on all of them looking at one example. So Glasnost Kids only adheres to two of Gamzu's trends here. But I think very, very importantly, if I am to kind of comment on Gamzu's trends, I would say most importantly is the focus on personal and national narratives, as opposed to purely just looking at narratives of the Holocaust. So kind of enveloping a Holocaust narrative within a larger story, which is exactly what Miriam does or is going to do within Glasnost Kids, looking at her grandmother's story, but it's just a small part of her larger story of identity. And again, we see similar trends in these two other examples of third generation Holocaust graphic narratives. But again, I would argue the most important of these trends is the focus on personal and or national narratives, as opposed to purely Holocaust narratives. So Jeremy Drey's We Won't See Auschwitz is a very good example of this, and really his title even shows this, kind of moving away from purely the Holocaust narrative. He and his brother go on a trip to Poland, and they very purposefully do not want to go to Auschwitz, where their family member suffered. They want to see Poland, where there was life before the Holocaust, and they want to see Poland now. They want to explore the national narratives of Poland and Jewish-Polish relationships. And you see the same thing in Rutu Modern's The Property. This is actually, as Gamzu points out, this is an example of one that is fictional. It's a fictional story, but they do, again, look at national narratives of Poland and kind of Israeli-Polish relationships, as well as very much focusing on the personal as well. So that seems to be, for now at least, kind of the way that third generation Holocaust graphic narratives are heading. And finally, we will look at how public perceptions of Miriam's Jewish identity changed before and after she created Holocaust graphic narratives. So I asked her, so you've already written about your work in terms of other Jewish comic artists. Has working with survivor stories in your graphic narratives affected how you see yourself within this Jewish artistic tradition? And she said, so I guess if somebody's looking at my overall body of work, it's harder to call me anti-Semitic now, which I have been called. I guess the Navs project is also a respectable project in their eyes. It's a story, a genre of story, that at least people think that they can understand it and respect it. Whereas I think a lot of the other Jewish stories I write are a little bit edgier, whether trying to be edgy or not. And I responded, how the graphic narrative genre has changed then, because, of course, back to Mouse, that was about as edgy as you get back in the day. And then now in your body of work, really the Holocaust graphic novels aren't the edgier or the more controversial in the public eye. And she said, yes, people forget how scandalized a lot of Jewish people were by Mouse when it came out, and now it's completely canon. And I use it as a fig leaf for what comics I do. So I thought that was a pretty powerful way to end, and a little thought-provoking maybe. So I will end it there. But as I said, I have a list of some reading that can be done if you are interested and hear some other third generation Holocaust graphic narratives, which are wonderful. I would highly recommend them. So thank you so much. And Svenja, I will hand it back over to you.
Yes, thank you very much, Betsy, for this highly interesting talk indeed. And before we will allow people to ask questions, and I'm sure there will be many, we will continue with the second talk and then in the end have the Q&A. We'll now introduce properly the second speaker. So Joël Cahen joins us with his talk, Maps, Models, Memory, Second Generation Art in the Netherlands, as I've said. And Joël has a broad expertise. He's a historian and Yiddish linguist. He has studied at the University in Amsterdam and at the YIVO in New York. He was then General Director of the Jewish Historical Museum in Amsterdam. Prior to that, also Chief Curator and Deputy Director General of Bethke in Tel Aviv and Curator for History at the Jewish Historical Museum in Amsterdam. He is currently running a consultancy for museums. He is also working on the biography of Jacob of Moses Lopez Quiros and the tensions between traditions and secularism in the 19th century. And I hand over to you now, and we are looking forward to hearing your talk on second generation memory in the Netherlands. Please, Joël.
Thank you. And thank you very much for inviting me, but please help me to get my presentation that you can see it, or do you see it?
Yes, we see
okay,
it.
I know I'm confused because I have two screens and it's not in the essential screen where I see your faces. Okay, I will take you to 1 minute. Yes. I will take you to start back to 1946, when a monument was built in Amsterdam. And as many monuments have been built in this city, a lot of them have been hotly discussed. This one is especially discussed in the last years, since it was called the Monument of Gratitude. It was a monument which you do not see here, because you see here the first design. The monument that it became looks like this. Very, very classical, romantic, and styled, I would say. But the original artist, Jaap Kaas, who was a Holocaust survivor, designed this. He wanted to show something that would show the public, we're talking immediately after the war, about the horrors of the Holocaust. And so he came up with this, and he decided that the names of all the victims should be in this monument. The people who assigned him the project didn't like this, found it too cruel, not thankful enough to those that had saved Jews, and got into a fight with Kaas. Kaas left, and Cahen, another survivor of the Holocaust, designed this monument, which was located at the Weesperplein, absolutely in the center of the Jewish neighborhood, and later moved in the 70s when a subway was built in Amsterdam, the first subway, to like a hidden place next to a then thought to be quite ugly student housing. The story of this monument is important in understanding the reception, the reworking, the getting to a level that people can live with the memory of the Holocaust in the Netherlands. A level that I think has not been reached, because daily life in this country has to do with the Holocaust, and there's hardly a day that we don't see this in the papers. Kaas, his work was rejected, Wertheim's was built. At the same time, we're talking about the late 40s, the diary of Anne Frank was discovered and slowly made its way into a tremendous popularity about which we do not have to talk. It stands, and it will always stand. because as the survivor of the Warsaw Ghetto, Mark Edelman told me in 1987 when I interviewed him, only through a story people will understand what the Holocaust was about. I think this is an indirect compliment to the former speaker and the power of the cartoons, of the visual diaries that she discussed. In any case, Anne Frank was not the only book published. There was another book published by a very famous Dutch writer, Gerard van het Reven, called The Demise of the Boslovich Family. This book, written about a communist, by a son of a communist, was about a Jewish family with all kinds of bad luck, and they were all killed, and the man himself killed himself also. What was so interesting about this novella? The word Jew is not mentioned. It's all implicit. It's implicit, and this was the power of the book, although it's more than that. In the years after the war, let's say between 46 and 70, the representation of the Holocaust was either scientific, with some important books, or it was about the resistance, and not about what happened to the Jews, nor about the collaborators and all of that. There was one exception, and that's what you see here in the middle, the commemoration of the strike in February 1941 in Amsterdam, which was a very, very important event in Jewish history because it was the only strike in Europe against the Nazis acting against the Jews. It was a strike organized by communist harbor workers taken over by Moore. It took maybe 36 hours and the Germans crushed it. But the strike started because Jewish groups that resisted forcefully to what Nazis did to them got into a fight, and a German guy was killed. As a represaille, more than 400 Jews were killed in Mauthausen or used as to try out the gas chambers in a nearby castle. So this strike, which was really something that the Dutch can be and the Amsterdam can be very, very proud of, was also commemorated immediately in 1946 by the then mayor of the city and a group of about 30,000 people who came together in the main square, the Waterloo Square of town. And it was also interesting because they did recall what happened, but they did also especially celebrate the courage of the strikers, rightfully, of course, but it was always a balance. And there was one person there who didn't leave her car, but she was there, the Dutch Queen. I put it here, this famous statue by Marie Andriessen, which one can consider definitely as Holocaust art, to my opinion. Between the beginning, the lighting of the candle in the Hollandse Schouwburg, the Holocaust Memorial, now to be part of the new National Holocaust Museum, on the left, and you see Mayor van Hal lighting it, and on the right, you see Otto Frank in 1960 standing in the then empty Anne Frank house, long before it became so famous, and only 2 years before it was opened. So for anybody who comes to Jerusalem or visits a bank in the south of Amsterdam, in the Van Leer Institute, there is a small copy of this dock worker of this statue. I will then try to explain how things moved, how memory moved. And there were several important things. The communists and the Netherlands Auschwitz Committee, which was also partly founded by communists, with early commemorations. Here you see them in the early 70s with a monument, a beautiful monument, which in a little bit different form is still in town, by the sculptor and writer Jan Wolkers. It is the Mirror Monument. The Mirror Monument which cries out what happened in heaven, and the mirrors are broken. So it will never be, the heaven will never be the same. This is a very abstract monument. We have seen this morning many non-abstract Holocaust art very directly. It was certainly under the influence of cultural figures in town, such as the director of the Stedelijk Museum, Sandberg, who later was the first director of the Israel Museum, who were all in favor of abstract. So this is from abstract in the early 70s to a different form of commemoration by a second generation survivor of the war, I should say, not a second generation Jew. Bart Domburg, who made this work, is a non-Jewish artist and who came to the Jewish Museum with this work, in which he wrote all the addresses of where Jews were taken from, which he had taken from another initiative, the Jewish Digital Monument. But see here a very important element: everybody is named. It's not the dock worker, it's not abstract, the heavens are crying out. It's, in my view, the new tendency to which I collaborate also. I just put a tile for a brother of my grandmother somewhere in the south of Holland. Everyone should be remembered. And Domburg did it with these writings. He did also other things. He wrote the Diary of Victor Klemperer completely on huge sheets. Here is one part of it. The digital monument, which was an initiative by the historian Lifshitz, you see here on the left in its original form, which I prefer, and on the right in its new, more accessible form. On the left, it is a computer generated colors, and where the colors are darker, there were more Jews. And all the 102,000 Jewish victims of the Holocaust are in it. It became now a major source for historians, and it commemorates everybody. It tries to commemorate because it still needs working up. There are still people of whom the whole family was killed, and we have a name and nothing else. Because besides the names here, there are also the stories in it. And it's open for the families to add stories. So this is a very important connecting point. It's a commemoration. It's not static. It's dynamic. It grows. And it does. And it is being used. I talked about the memory of gratitude, and I very much wanted to show you this. The monument of gratitude was taken from its place, and in its place will come now a huge Daniel Libeskind designed monument with all the names. Again, an initiative of the Auschwitz Committee in the Netherlands. An initiative, a political pushing, with a lot of pushing and stories about it. But the thing is coming about, and it is a beauty. And it is in the middle of the ruined Jewish neighborhood. That is a highway, which became a highway after the metro was built and all the empty houses were taken away. And opposite, as you can see, is a beautiful student house. It's important because it will be, to my view, an attraction, as this student house is Herzberger's interpretation of Le Corbusier's Ville Radieuse. Again, from abstract to family stories to everybody. During the Holocaust, during the occupation, Pekidim officials of the Amsterdam municipality drew for the Germans exactly where the Jews lived. And you can see here, 1 minute, where it's dark, there were the most. This is the Jewish quarter. This is in the eastern part and other parts. It's the the map of dots, which used to hang in the Holocaust Memorial. It probably will hang in the new Holocaust Museum. It inspired another second generation artist, but again, second generation, and in this case, I know the artist. I like him, but I've never asked him the question, are you Jewish? What is the connection? I've just seen that this man, like a real artist, is completely obsessed in a very, very professional way in mapping out, and came to this, because from this, he made a map of all Amsterdam during the war, and he incorporated all the elements of the occupation, where the bombs fell, where the hunger droppings were, where people were executed, everything in one map. And he did that also for Lodz, Litzmannstadt, the ghetto, and he developed it, and he developed it. As you can see here with his website on it, you can zoom into every small detail. Again, this is the movement from general commemoration, personal commemoration, to having all to rebuild it. I connected also to what you see, to my, I must be honest, my disgust when Scheike Weinberg, the first director of Beit HaTfutzot, came to me before I moved to Israel, and said, Joël, he was then the director of the National Holocaust Museum in Washington, I got it. He got a train car. And I thought, this is disgusting. Why should one have a train car? But I must admit, now that many other Holocaust museums have it, it is, of course, a very, very vivid tool to trigger memory. Now I get to another point of memory. This is not by a second generation, this is by a survivor. In Holland, very famous, Jules Schelvis, who was 2 days in Sobibor, enough to lose his wife and everybody else who was with him in the train. And then he was, as a strong little boy, chosen to go somewhere else. After the war, he lived for the memory of Sobibor, to tell the story, and he did. And he made a model of the camp, which you see here. After I studied this and talked about this with others, I understood that all survivors, there may have been 30 in total, made maps of the camp of Sobibor. One other I knew, it was the late Dov Feierberg in Ramle, Israel. I knew him through the teacher in New York where I studied, who told me to read his fresh memory of 1946, recorded by Yivo or by a predecessor of Yad Vashem in Yiddish, of the revolt in Sobibor. A story that I heard, and it's too terrible to listen to or to read. By accident, I met both his daughters. This is the second, Yael Atzmoni. She lives in Ramle, she was born in Ramle in Israel, and she became a keramist. And Dov also made a map of the camp, and she, as a keramist, made it into ceramics, and then rolled it, and it's like, how do you call it, binocular. So you look through the rolled map back to the past. here it is, a very good artist, a very good ceramist, and a very strong way of commemorating. In her newest work, she goes to this, which I find very difficult, but I must admit, it is important. It's the dog. And it goes back to one of the stories of her father about the dogs the Nazis used. From there, now we had the map, we had the persons, all of them, again, to a person, Jeroen Krabbe, a Dutch actor, and who is also an artist, who started discovering late, I think after 1980, his family history and created a Sobibor commemoration for his grandfather, Avraham Reis, which you see here. Back to the little stones. I think they are called in English the pebble stones, of which you see here one, and next to it you see it on a grave in a cemetery. Both ways of commemoration, and on the right, on the wall of a former synagogue. The persons in the artist are Amos van Gelder, second generation ex-Israeli soldier, who painted the whole family of his mother. And every round is something about them. Or the artist Sam Drucker, who made his minyan about 10 people of 90 in 2014, who he made a portrait of. And then at the end, also to bring the core of my, one of the cores of this story, the artist Marlène Dumas, not Jewish, South African, living in Holland, who on an assignment for the Jewish Museum was asked for an exhibition called Liberations to make a work. And she brought this to the museum. It's the Nuremberg trial. And then, more than 30 years later, she was in the Jewish Museum and she said, but I had meant to make this, and then I thought not. Mind the difference, 1985, 2015, and here you see a faceless face. Thank you.